Travis Walton.
Thanks for coming. How many people saw the movie? Well, I guess by now you probably realize that they got a little creative there and changed some things. But I am looking to, in the future, possibly getting a remake of the movie and getting them to tell it how it really happened. But for now, that's what I'm going to do. November 5th, 1975, a day that changed my life forever. I was working in the woods with a crew of 6 other guys. There were 7 of us all together. In the movie, they only had 6, but we put in a long day, and it's starting to get dark. We loaded up our equipment, and we're headed home. We're driving along this rough dirt road, and everybody was talking away. In the movie, it looked like everybody was kind of dozing off, but we hadn't gone very far down the road, and so, we were wide awake. We'd just recently been, doing vigorous physical work, and so our senses were as awake as you can get. And I noticed this light up to our right. The road we were on was paralleling the ridge going south back up towards the rim road, and the crest of the ridge was to our right and a little higher than the road itself. But when I noticed this light coming through the trees, it wasn't like immediately it was so alarming that everybody said, "What's that?" I was looking, and before I said anything to anybody else, one by one, all these little conversations that were going on amongst the crew dropped off, and everybody was looking in the same direction. And we were wondering what that was, and it was deer hunting season, so I thought that maybe there was some hunters camped there. But the light was coming from higher than where ground level would be. I could see a break in the trees up ahead where the light was coming across the road. I urged Mike to, hurry up, get up there so we can see, what's going on, because people were saying, "What is that?" And this is part of the movie where they were fairly accurate. As soon as we got to where that light was crossing the road, there it was. It was unmistakable. This object was hovering less than 100 feet away. The skeptics were later saying, "Oh, they saw the planet Jupiter," and stupid things like that. It didn't look anything like swamp gas. This was a distinct metallic object hovering less than 100 feet away. Alan Dallas yelled out, "It's a flying saucer," and I called for Mike to stop the truck. Because I was thinking, this is a, incredible thing, but, so often when we're in the woods and you caught sight of a deer or bear or something, you'd call the rest of the crew attention to it, and before they could even look, it'd be gone. They might not even see what you saw. So that's kind of what I was thinking. When I threw open the door and started towards it, I thought it would be gone before I got very close. It was kind of a brazen act, all right, and the guys in the truck were pretty alarmed by what I was doing, and started yelling at me almost immediately to come back to the truck. And myself, I was wrestling with some misgivings about what I was doing, because it didn't leave like I expected it to. And so I was kind of stuck with that one. There's the crew, Mike, Ken Peterson, Alan Dallas, the Black Sheep. Been in and out of trouble ever since. I heard recently that he's back in trouble. But there's Dwayne Smith and John Glett. I recently had him on an interview with me on the NBC Today show back on the 12th of this month, and they did a pretty fair job of it. And anybody that saw that, I'd encourage everybody to please get in touch with the Today Show and express some appreciation for having got it right for a change, because the media needs encouragement when they get it right, because so often they've got to have that little snicker at the end or some sort of a negative slant. But anyway, and then on the bottom right was Steve Pierce. I hadn't heard from him in many years, back since right after it happened, and he got in touch with me here last year and was interested in talking about it again. I've been trying to find Dwayne Smith and Alan Dallas again, to get their, their current perspectives on things. But, as recently as when I talked to them last, along about the time the movie was made, everybody was, had pretty much come to terms with what happened to us. Anyway, crew truck, double cab truck, that's how 7 people fit in one truck. This is part of the state where it happened. Pretty rugged backcountry at that time. I may as well tell you about that right there. There's this kind of a coincidence. Found this map, topographical map. It had divided up the state into all these different areas, and just one of the many coincidences surrounding this incident. The area that they designated for where this happened was Area 51. Go figure. maybe the map maker's idea of a joke, but this is how it looked to me when I got up close to it, and it was incredible, an incredible sight. And John Glett here on the Today Show that just aired remarked about how to him it looked so perfect. He said it was like a new Corvette. It was. When I was just standing there in awe of this thing, looking up at it. It was metallic in some areas and glowing in other areas. What you see on the bottom of it here, looking up at this angle, are reflections of the trees and everything. But it was smooth like glass, but this light kind of lit up everything with kind of a strange sort of a glow. It gave it kind of a strange feeling. The sound it was making was really very difficult to describe, because there was a sort of a rumble, a real deep rumble that you could almost feel more than hear. And the same thing with the higher notes; they were like off the range of human hearing. So those kind of sounds, when you turn your head, it doesn't change that much, which gives a kind of a where's this coming from kind of a strange feeling. But when I got up close, the guys were really getting very anxious and swearing at me and telling me to get away from there. And it suddenly got louder and it started to move. It was kind of with a little rocking motion as it rose up. And that scared me more than I was already scared. But there was this pile of logging debris. And that was the reason I had stopped. I got about as close as I could looking up at it without running over this big pile of logs. And so when it started to move, I jumped down behind a log there, and they were saying, run, get out of here, let's go. And I didn't need to be told. I was trying to figure out, how to get to safety and leave the relative safety of the cover behind the log. But I was down in a crouch, and I raised up to sprint back to the truck. And at that moment, bam, it was just like I'd been hit and didn't see it coming. It was really kind of a stunning blow sort of a feeling. Just like numbness really quickly spread through me, and I blacked out. But the crew said that it was like this beam came out of the bottom of this craft and hit me, but it was like I'd stepped on a landmine, or like a grenade had gone off, and the explosion threw me back through the air. I've been saying it threw me back 10 feet, but Steve, when he called me up, he was saying, no, it was 20 feet. But whatever it was, they said that it looked to them the way, I didn't protect myself when I hit, and the way my body was limp, that they thought it had killed me. And they, were yelling as much back and forth to each other and screaming at Mike to get him out of there. And so they took off, and a lot of talks. I've run into people who have, sort of disparaged the crew for not standing their ground there. But I always want to add that, I find no fault with these guys for having taken off like that, because they thought I was dead, and they thought I was they were next. And so, what good would it do them to get themselves killed rescuing somebody who's already dead? So it's perfectly understandable. They took off, dang near wrecked the truck several times getting away from there. And they once they got close to the rim road, they'd stop briefly, but they said that they caught sight of some hunters and went trying to catch the truck and see if they could get some people with some guns to help them. I guess even then they knew that they were going to have to go back and see what they could do. They were unable to catch the deer hunters, so they did return to the site, and they had a lot of fear, approaching it. Somebody said they thought they saw the object leaving, but it was only when they actually got there that they, confirmed that it didn't seem to be there anymore. But then neither was I, and they said they made a search. At one point, Mike, really fell to his knees and broke down crying, and Ken helped him up, and they stayed in a real tight bunch trying to make a search. They only had one flashlight, and they were all just huddled together trying to, do what they had to do, trying to see if they could rescue me. And I give those guys a lot of credit for that, but they were unable to find me, so they went back to town, and they argued about what to do. And Alan didn't want to go to the authorities right away. He figured that they ought to just go get some friends with some guns and come back, make a search, and then if they couldn't find anything, report it. But Mike and Ken said, no, we gotta, what if Travis is never found? How'll that look if we don't go report it right away? So they called the local deputy, and he came down, and he called the sheriff in, and the sheriff said that he was immediately struck with that these guys had been through something really traumatic. But apparently all the lawmen, being lawmen, suspected that there had been some foul play, and that this was just a cover story for why no one was going to see me again. So unlike in the movie, they did go back with half the crew to make a search that night. And again, I give those guys credit for that. But the real manhunt began the next morning. The sheriff got together, over 50 volunteers and the sheriff's posse and deputies and Forest Service people, search and rescue teams. They had a very organized search in which they combed the entire area on foot. They had men on horseback. There was four-wheel drives. The tracking dogs were brought in at one point. They had airplanes and helicopters crisscrossing the area. And during this time, in my recent conversation with John, he was saying that what the lawmen did is they separated the crew up, and as the crew were helping with the search, one deputy or officer with each of the men, and they were basically all pushing the men to confess to the murder. John said, he says, "Come on, just tell us what really happened so we can all go home and, get this over with." So the men got really tired of the accusations, and they said, we'll take any test you want. Give us sodium pentothal lie detector tests. We're telling the truth. We did not kill him. We saw what we saw. And so the sheriff heard about that and set up a lie detector test with the state police, Department of Public Safety polygraph examiner. Came up and tested all the men there at the jail, at the courthouse. And so when they passed, it was new theories. And people were desperate to explain this away any way they could. Theories that all the men were hallucinating on drugs, that I'd had a transitory psychosis, that the hypnotist that I saw later had implanted memories. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. The first thing I recall after being hit by the beam was waking up real slowly. I was in a lot of pain. I was in and out of consciousness for quite a while. I don't know how long, but I didn't know where I was at first. And then, I remembered approaching the object, and I thought that maybe I'd been hurt somehow and that the crew had brought me to the hospital. So I assumed that I was in a hospital. I could feel they had something across my chest. And I was on some kind of a raised surface, a bed or a gurney or something, operating table. And it hurt so bad, and I was having trouble breathing. Couldn't get enough air. I felt like I was suffocating. But there was a light above me, and I didn't want to move too much because of the pain. I thought maybe I'd make things worse if I moved, but I could hear the sounds of movement around me, and I thought that these were just doctors. And I was having trouble focusing my eyes. This light above me wasn't all that bright, but it kind of hurt to look at it because, the pain in my head and chest was pretty intense. And but I looked to my right, and I saw this face, and then I could focus on it, and this was not a doctor. I was looking into the face of this creature, and I just flipped out. The surge of fear gave me enough strength to move, but it was still very hard to move. I lifted my arm up to knock it away from me, but it was more of a push than anything, and he fell back into the other one. And it was lighter and softer than I expected, but I was still just so terrified. And a lot of people don't understand the degree of fear that I was experiencing, but all these things combined to make me react negatively in a way far more uncontrollably than I probably would have had it not happened that way. See, I'm in all this pain. I'm struggling to breathe. It's dimly lit in a very small, cramped room. It's humid, and you know, if you can't catch your breath, that's probably the most panic-inducing thing that there is, and that's why, you know, waterboarding is so effective at getting information out of terrorists, you know, because nothing will make you more afraid than that. It's on a very basic, instinctive level. But when I rolled off the table and staggered back away from them, they came around the table towards me, and I fell back against the. There was kind of a workbench or a shelf, low shelf there against the back wall, and they were coming towards me. So I just grabbed something off of that and I struck out at them. They weren't close enough to hit, but I was just screaming threats, and it must have worked because they stopped. They sort of extended their hands towards me. And the thing that really stands out in my mind, the thing that was the main feature of my nightmares for so long after that, was those eyes, the way they looked at me. And these were not black obsidian eyes like you hear reported quite so often. They had pupils and irises and eyelids, because I saw them blink. And but their gaze, for some reason, it seemed like they were looking right into me in a really disturbing kind of way. It wasn't like the expression. There wasn't really much expression to their face. It wasn't frozen like a mask, but it still was a kind of a detached sort of look that, you know, I just felt. It's really hard to describe the emotion that caused in me. It was just very disturbing. You know, when you're around somebody that you feel doesn't care about you one way or the other, they don't have to be hostile. We still kind of interpret that as negative, you know, as unfriendly. But I was thinking about, there was only one door, and it was beyond them. So I was thinking of how I could fight my way past them and escape. But before I could move, they turned and went out the door. And there was this little passageway that went to the right. So, you know, I was afraid they'd come back, so I went to the door and went to the left, just looking for a way out. Well, you know, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was in a total, just blind panic that there was no clear thought to it. I was thinking, open a door and get out. Maybe in the back of my mind, I was thinking this thing was still in the woods and I could jump to the ground real easily, but it's probably a good thing I wasn't able to open a door, but that probably wasn't the best thing to do right at that time. But I went down this passageway, and I was really kind of in this weird sort of a panic because I couldn't see very far ahead. It curved to the right so far I couldn't see very much in front of me or behind me. So I was, you know, kind of torn between sprinting away from these creatures that I woke up to and whatever freedom I might find ahead. But I came to a door, and there was a room, and I could see, you know, what I took to be doors, the outlines of doors on the other side. And piecing together the floor plan of what I saw later, you know, I figured out that those probably doors wouldn't have been close to the outside of this craft. But at that point, I didn't really know where I was very disoriented, and I was hoping those would be a door out of this craft. And the curious thing about this room is that when I entered it, the closer I got to the middle, the darker it became, and I could see points of light on the walls, floor, ceiling, everything. It was either like you could see through these surfaces or it was projected onto there, some kind of a map or a planetarium type situation. But the chair in the middle had controls on it, and so my main interest was to try to find a way to open a door, and I was hoping that some of these buttons would open one of these doors. But most of them didn't seem to do anything. Nothing that I could detect, but moving the lever caused the star pattern to all shift at once. You know, the stars stayed in the same pattern, but the whole thing moved, and I was already unsteady on my feet, and that really gave me vertigo. But so I was thinking of pushing another one of these buttons, and then something caught my attention from the door that I had come through, and I saw this man standing there. Now, from the door, looking over this guy's shoulder, you normally would not see the star pattern because you could really only see that from near the chair. At least that's what I was thinking, but you know, it's possible that it just was activated by being near the chair. Anyway, I turned around, I saw him, and I thought, you know, that right off, I thought it was somebody from NASA or Air Force or somebody to rescue me from this situation. And so I took him to be a human rescuer, and I run up to him and started babbling all these questions, and but he wasn't responding. And I thought, well, maybe it's the helmet, you know, he can't hear me or can't talk with that on. So I went with him, and he seemed to be in a hurry, and I was pretty weak and unsteady on my feet. But he took me out of this craft, and at this point, it was parked inside of this large room, a hangar-like room, because there were these glowing panels that curved from one wall up into the ceiling. So it was shaped kind of like a quarter of a cylinder. But the biggest relief was getting outside of this thing. The air was fresher and easier to breathe. And I tried to look around, but he seemed to be in a hurry and was pulling me along, and I really had to think about my walking because I was still hurting a lot and unsteady on my feet. But there were other craft in there, at least two I know for sure, that were disc-shaped but shinier and more rounded. So I don't know whether this was a building or part of a larger craft, or how long the craft that I was in had been inside of this area. But he hurried me out of this big room, down a hallway to a room where he left me with some people who were dressed like him. And it was just a sort of a blue coverall that without any kind of insignia, no flags or rank markings or anything like that. But the fact that these other people didn't have any helmets on made me think that, well, maybe finally somebody can answer my questions. I'm kind of exaggerating the thinking part because I was so in total panic and my head was so foggy that I wasn't thinking real clear. I was basically hysterical. And so, but I did try to talk to these people, and they didn't say a word, not to me or not to each other. They started leading me over and trying to get me to lay down on this table. And I'd had enough of these table things, you know. But I was so weak and they were so strong that they didn't have too much trouble getting me onto that table. But One of them appeared to be female. Had what looked like an oxygen mask that she put over my face, and I was struggling, not too successfully. And I did manage to jerk my hand away and get it under the edge of the mask, but before I could pull it away, I blacked out. Next thing I know, I came to cold air, lying face down. My hand was laying on my arm. I wasn't in the road, but I was enough on the pavement where I wasn't off in the brush. But I saw a light above, and I looked to see where the light was coming from, but it went off before I could see what was actually lit. So it might have been some kind of a light or a hatch closing or something. But I just saw this silvery, rounded surface hovering above me there. So it wasn't exactly in the middle of the road, kind of partially off to one side. And then it just shot straight up right past the trees. It sort of stirred the leaves around and moved the limbs, but it was silent. It shot up, and it was tiny in seconds. Just amazing that something could move that fast without, breaking the sound barrier or something, But I was just relieved that I was back in familiar surroundings. A lot of people wouldn't feel too comfortable standing alone in the dark in the middle of the woods, but it was a big improvement for me. I looked down and I saw these lights, and I figured out, I recognized the lights of Heber, and that's not where I live. This is the town nearest where it happened, but 15 miles from where the incident occurred. So I don't know where I got the strength. I was a little wobbly when I stood up, but I ran down into the town looking to get help. First building I came to with lights on, there was smoke coming out of the chimney. I pounded on the door and nobody came. So I went on down. There was probably a closer phone than where I went, but I didn't want to go back into the side streets that were, darker. So I ran on down across the second bridge, and I came to a row of telephone booths, and I managed to call my family. First phone booth I came into, though, was out of order, and I was at the end of my rope, strength-wise, but I went into the next phone booth and called my brother-in-law, and he thought it was a prank call. He started to hang up on me. I think you got the wrong number, wise guy. So I screamed and made him understand that, it was me. And he seemed kind of stunned, but he says, okay, I'll get your brother and come and get you. And so to me, it seemed like hardly any time at all until the lights of the truck were shining into there, and they came and got me out of the bottom of that phone booth where I'd collapsed. But it had to have been at least 30 or 40 minutes, so I was probably unconscious part of that time. But found out later, the skeptics were doubtful of everything. They were claiming I was really someplace else, but the sheriff, the phone operator, listened in on the phone call because, you didn't have to have coins to talk to the operator in that part of the country at that time, and so the operator just listened in on the call and called the sheriff and reported it. And so the sheriff sent a man out there, but my brother had already taken me away. And I got in the truck, and I said something, and he said, because I thought this was still the same night, and he said, Travis, feel your face. It's been 5 days. But see, I was trying to tell him what happened. I was talking. I just broke down. I just couldn't get it out. He said, it's okay, it's okay. He put his arm around me. And it's kind of extra emotional now because this brother passed away recently. His funeral was Monday. And he was there for me, and he's, you know, there'd been so much going on, so much controversy, the search, and all the accusations, all the crank calls and everything. And my brother said, there's no way I'm going to let that crazy mob get a hold of this guy in the shape he's in. And so he didn't, you know, call up the sheriff and hand me over. Plus, you know, there was other reasons. He didn't want to just turn me over to the sheriff. There'd been some suggestions from people. There was some ground saucer watch people at the site, and they had warned him about what might happen if I were ever returned. And there were a couple of calls. One was from a nurse that said that she was working in a hospital where an elderly couple had had some kind of a close encounter with something and had been brought in, and she said when she come back on shift the next night, the couple was gone, their records were gone, and everybody was trying to pretend like they hadn't been there. So her warning was, you know, be careful who gets a hold of him if he ever turns up again. And another guy said he was retired CIA, made a similar warning, and he left his contact information. Sounded, you know, like didn't sound like a kook. So my brother was concerned about that, and so the main thing he was worried about was I okay physically, and so he took me to Phoenix. And to his house, and then right from there to try to get some medical help. The first people we hooked up with were recommended by the ground saucer watch people, but it turned out to be not a medical doctor at all. He was actually some kind of a quack, but figured that out and left. And so the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization figured out where I really was, even though my brother was saying I was in a hospital in Tucson. They figured it out before the sheriff, apparently. And they arranged some medical tests with doctors that they had in their Phoenix membership. And there was immediately all kinds of things being raised. That I'd had a transitory psychosis, that I only believed that I'd experienced these things, that it was all a hallucination, that I'd become crazy and then become sane again, or that it was all a drug hallucination. That was the accusation from the ground saucer watch people, because since they weren't getting the investigation and they were jealous of APRO, they attacked. But I had a whole bunch of tests, medical tests and the psychiatric exams that, you know, showed a perfectly normal pattern of scores. There were, you know, examinations by psychiatrists that, you know, that I was perfectly normal in that respect. And I had blood and urine samples put through the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, showed no trace of any drug in my body. And then there was the accusation that the hypnotist had planted these memories in me. But what none of these theories took into consideration is how do 7 people have the same delusion? You know, it just didn't make any sense, and I just wondered why the press would even take these things seriously, because it didn't explain the facts of the matter at all, and especially not facts to do with, you know, physical traces that were left at the site. The ground saucer watch people themselves had taken some very strange magnetic readings at the site. They'd gridded the whole area out and took these readings with these Gauss meters, and they'd found that there was these very high level readings with an actual polarity reversal at one end of the clearing. And I heard right off from the men that the Forest Service guy had a Geiger counter. Since then, I've heard that a lot of other people had come out there with Geiger counters and that they'd found high radiation levels at the clearing. But none of that came out at that time. Only Mike and the crew, reported that some of the high radiation levels were taken off of the equipment, the hard hats that they'd had at the time of the incident. But all that stuff kind of got covered over in the controversy at the time. But it came out later that there had been some pretty dramatic changes in the growth of the trees at the site. There's a picture in my book of this core sample from one of the trees. When we went out there to do this TV show for Paramount, I think it was Inside Edition or hard copy, one of those. Went out there in the middle of the winter. It was 3 feet of snow, but they rented these big snow cats so we could get there anyway. And so when we finally found the spot, I thought the difficulty in finding the spot was because the snow was so deep. But later on, I found out that Mike had gone back and checked it out, and he'd found that it was because the trees had grown so rapidly right next to where the craft had come down. This picture here is a core sample out of one of those, and you can count the rings backward, which he's marked with a pen there. Back to the time of the incident, the tree rings were all of a uniform size, but very much thicker. This tree was like 85 years old in the winter of '75, November, when it happened. And then here, only 15 or so years later, the tree had doubled in size. And so, they did some calculations and figured out that these trees were producing wood fiber at 36 times the rate they had been in the previous nearly 100 years. So that was pretty interesting. That was something that kind of got overlooked and ignored for quite some time until Linda Howe came to Snowflake. She was in the state for some other business, and so we arranged to take advantage of the trip and go out there, and she was going to collect some samples, some soil samples and some plant samples and whatnot for research. And on the way out there, we figured out that we were going out there on the exact anniversary of the incident. So that was pretty anxious sort of trip out there. But we got out of there before dark, and I was grateful for that. But, it's just been a whole lot of things that we really don't have time to cover in too great a detail, but there are a lot of interesting things about the attempts to cover it up. There was one incident. There was a guy came to town, a federal criminal investigator. He said he had this badge and went to Mike and was accusing him of having invented a fictitious character, his brother, who was a partner on one of his contracts. And he says, no, we're having a family reunion. It so happens at this time. I'll go introduce you to him. So, but it was one thing after another, and finally this guy, he was very aggressive, intimidating, and he wrote up this confession that he tried to force Mike to sign. Mike said, I'm not signing that. That's not true. So the guy got very angry and he left, but found out later that he wasn't there about Forest Service contracts, because that was just the cover story. He'd gone to the sheriff and asked for a copy of the file, which coincidentally disappeared when it came time to do a little research for Paramount. They wanted us to go get a copy of the file because, we had the right to do that since it was a closed file. And Sheriff's Department said, sure, come back tomorrow, we'll have copies for you. And so Mike went back the next day and they said, sorry, can't find it, it's gone. So, but the sheriff was not in on any cover-up there because he had a lot of that stuff in his personal files at home, and he gave us some copies of it. That's where I got a lot of information about stuff that went on, that there were people who came to him and reported seeing things from a distance. And one case in particular, somebody called me and about the time the movie was being made and said that he was out there at the time that the incident happened, and that he was deer hunting there with his wife, and he said his wife would vouch for that even though they were now divorced, and that he had been on this next hill, and he described the terrain to me. It's rugged backcountry. There's not really a whole lot of landmarks that you could guide somebody to the exact spot. So from his descriptions, I could tell that he had actually been there, and he was saying that he saw the glow of the craft and the flash of the beam and everything. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I called Tracy Torme, who wrote the script for the movie, and told him about it. But we were off traveling around doing all these interviews all over the country, so I didn't give it any more thought. But I found out later that Paramount flew him out to Hollywood and interviewed him, and they got suspicious. So they had him polygraphed, and he took a polygraph test, actually 2 of them, from the same one who tested me and the rest of the crew, the state police polygraph examiner who'd gone into private practice. And very strange results. He passed the part about being there, about seeing the beam and everything. But see, one of his explanations was that why he was coming forward so late. I thought it was cool that we had this independent witness, and he was saying, well, he was in military intelligence at the time, stationed in Texas, and he'd ask his superior, should I get involved? These guys are accused of murder. And they told him, well, unless they're actually indicted, just stay out of it. And since the men passed the test and they were not indicted, he said he'd always regretted not corroborating by coming forward and telling what he'd seen. So he took this test and he passed the part about seeing the beam and the craft and about being there and even about being in military intelligence. Okay. Then he takes another test and they're asking him about his connections to the debunkers, this Philip Klass guy, and he flunked. He flunked the test on that question. So that was kind of disturbing. Somebody from military intelligence, seems to be having some sort of interaction with the people out to discredit the case. And so that there's some sort of covert government activity in regards to this increases all the time. I haven't had too much contact with Mike Rogers, the crew boss, in recent years. We're kind of on the outs, but I talked to him a while back, and he told me that there's been some federal agents harassing him in a variety of ways that he's promised to fill me in on, but he says it's still going on. They're still doing it, which I think is kind of funny. Why are they bothering him so much when maybe I haven't seen anything? I've had some problems that I wouldn't attribute it to anybody in particular, just problems with my book. Can't prove anything one way or the other about that, My first book, The Walton Experience, came out, 50,000 copies sold, boom, just like that. And then all of a sudden I'm getting all these letters from people, where can I get a copy? I can't get one. So I, write to the publisher and ask them, why aren't you printing another copy, another printing? Well, we're not doing that. Okay, all right, well, give me my rights back then. They said, we can't understand why you want your rights back when there's so much selling life left. Well, if there's a selling life, how come you won't make another printing? So that was kind of curious. So he just dropped it. And then the 1993 book, same kind of a situation. They claimed that the book wasn't selling. Well, there's a lot to go on there. And I had some funny goings-ons with an agent. He just kind of dragged his feet and dragged things out and everything. And then I find out that, I said, okay, well, never mind, send all that stuff back. And I get everything back except the part about Philip Klass. That one little part is missing from the whole thing. Well, wow. That's just a coincidence that part got lost. A lot of little funny things. Like I say, can't prove anything by that. But I did see a copy of Philip Klass's FBI file recently, kind of a real eye-opener, surprised me. Apparently they had investigated him way back and in regard to his revealing some classified information. And he was under investigation. They declined not to prosecute, but there's some interesting comments in there that kind of fit in with the whole scenario. That makes me suspect that basically they had some leverage on him to get him to act as their propagandist. Whether that's the case or not, he certainly was a propagandist. But anyway, over the years, Alan Dallas and Mike Rogers were retested, repolygraphed. They passed with flying colors. I took a test two tests with them at that time. And then here, a couple of years ago, I took another 2 polygraph tests. So I've passed 5 different polygraph tests in regard to this matter. But it seems that the questions will never end. And I guess, for those who know, no proof is necessary. And for those who don't want to believe, no amount of proof is ever enough. But there's so much more to talk about, but time is running short. So I'll just take a couple of real quick questions because we're about out of time. Okay.
Is your book available here?
Yeah, my book is available here, and it's a new updated edition. It just come out a few months ago, and so when this is over, I'll be back out there at my table in there with everyone else. And so if you have any more questions at that time, I'll be happy to talk to you there. But until they come and pull me away from here, I'll take another question. Okay?
When you were originally going out to the craft, did you feel that you were influenced in any way by someone?
Okay. The question was, was I under their control when I approached the craft? And I did not feel that way. They're telling me I'm out of time, but I'll tell you this. Steve and Alan both said it looked to them like I was in some kind of a trance, like drawn to it like a zombie. But to me, I was just entranced in the metaphorical sense of, just in awe of this thing and curious about seeing it up close. And, I'll admit there was a little bit of show off there a little bit, but, I certainly came to regret that. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. Let's talk to you out there.